Welcome to the show. So, hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm. I'm once again joined with my good friend Doug Hagren. Hey, Doug.
Hey, Kirk, you know me, always doing last minute scramble here, getting stuff for the listeners, but I'm doing great. I know they say it's the most boring and like unintelligent thing to talk about is the weather, but I am proud to say that we've got 10 days of forecast of sun because if you live where I live in Minnesota and you come out of that winter, that is life worth living right there. So hopefully wherever you're at, you have a life worth living as well. So
Well, my life worth living is not living in Minnesota, Doug.
listen, I've been to Boston in the winter. It's not much better. At least you do have the ocean. We got lakes. But at the end of the day, Lake Superior is like a big ocean. It's like being on the coast of Maine. And, politics aside, the truth is, listen, Boston is colder in the winter than up here. I've walked it. My sister went to Emerson College. Dude, when that wind comes off the Atlantic and funnels and it just gets squeezed between those buildings, I don't know how you survive it, man. Minnesota is way more comfortable than that. At least we have cold, calm days. You just have this constant rocking off of the bay.
Yeah, but It's warmer though. I used to live in the city for like 16 years, and it was canyoning effect. Every day you walk out and you just got this like whoosh right down the street. But it's also warmer in the city. It doesn't snow as much, but anyway, so Boston's Boston. We had some good run of weather finally after a really weird winter of cold, but not too cold. It was like 35 all winter, so we didn't get enough snow. But anyway, enough about the weather. That's easy talk. So let's get into what's going on in the world. So I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of where we left off last week, where we talked a little bit about housing. I wanted to get into some dynamics, and I wanted to start off with another famous framework that we have on the show. And I'm going to share this screen with you. And I'm going to not make it political, but this chart looks like we're going to start talking about politics, and we're not. So this chart.
Darn. Oh, wrong show. That's my other podcast.
Yeah. So this chart is it's basically it's called the immigration crisis at the southwest border. Now people are going to flip out. They're going to be like, "What are you talking about?" And everyone's going to flip out. We're not talking about politics. We're just talking about just numbers. And we want to lead this into the next part of this. Now, I'm going to mention it like this. Now, this is not an opinion piece about immigration because otherwise, people all get fired up. But I want to point something out, right? So we talked about in the past on how people have two sides of an issue on like the green movement or global warming or whatever. And I think we can all agree on the underlying premise. What we don't agree on is the solution, right? So, global warming, no one wants a dirty planet. Everyone wants a clean planet. The issue is we disagree on how to go about that. And here's another issue, which is the same thing, right? Immigration is a highly complicated issue. Highly complicated. We can't come up with an answer. Everyone's going to say, "Well, I got an answer." No, you don't. It's more complicated than I've talked to so many people, and there's hair on all of it. So it's not clean. But I do want to use this as a framework because I think it's really important to understand. So last week we talked about unemployment. We have unemployment which is at record lows. I shouldn't say record lows, but it's at the lower end of the range of what is possible or historically possible. It's really low, right? We don't have enough people to work. We have basically technology which is taking jobs. You have internationally, you have jobs that we've outsourced traditionally for the last 20 years are starting to come back, which is good. But those jobs are coming back, but for whatever reason, we still have low unemployment, which means that we just don't have people to fill those jobs. So obviously, if you look at a bigger picture, and I don't put a lot of stock in economists. I have a degree in economics, so I can say that. It's kind of that whole thing. You can only dunk on your own. Well, I'm dunking on my own. Economics is a dismal science, as they say, and there's a reason for that. But I will say that the whole concept of immigration, we have a global problem. Is we have economies globally that are growing, and we have a stagnant, or in some countries' case, shrinking pool of labor. Now, you have some European countries like France, for example, where their demographics are shrinking. You have fewer people working in France. It's not growing. The economy is not necessarily growing, but you have a labor problem because you have fewer and fewer people. So in most countries, you have 2.1, 2.2 kids or whatever the number is. That's, kind of a flat line. If you have three kids between two and three, then the country's technically growing a little bit. But if you have one kid, like France, I think it's like 1.4 kids is the average a family has, which means that you're shrinking. You're not replacing your existing population. So countries like France, they take a lot of immigrants from other countries, and then people complain and they say, cultural stuff and all these complaints, right? But a lot of European countries have this problem. So you have on one hand of the problem, you have people that don't want other people to immigrate to their country. On the other hand, they know that they need to, or else their economy just shrinks over time and just, people just disappear. It's just the nature of things, right? And so any emerging, I shouldn't say any, most emerging economies or countries, um, they have a high population growth rate, and they can sustain more economic growth because of that. Whereas much more established countries have a slower growth rate of population, or neutral, or even declining. And as economies mature, they tend to have declining growth rates. Japan is a good example. They had, I think it was 2010, they sold more adult diapers than baby diapers in that year, because the older population is growing, the younger generation is not. China also had a similar problem with their one child policy. If you're only allowed to have one child, that means at some point you're going to have a big part of society that's going to be cut in half. And that's actually one of the big problems that they're starting to have, and it's going to get worse over the years, because as this one child policy filters through the whole economy, at some point, let's say for 15 years, you say, all right, I think whatever it was, 20 years, one child policy. Okay, so for 20 years, you have half the amount of people being born in China. And then as they mature, 0 to 20, 1 to 21, 2 to 22, and so on and so forth, as they age, that like gap filters through the economy. Well, if you have a bunch of schools and you're expecting 1 million people to go to school and 500,000 go, well, now the class is going to be empty. There's just the dynamics are different. And then once they get into the work world, well, you're now going to have fewer employees for the same jobs. So it causes big problems. And China is seeing this, right? And with the European countries, with the US, we don't have that same. We do have a similar problem with like the baby boomers and the millennials. They had that like Python effect where you had the deer going through the Python, where it's effectively it's a big bubble and then it goes back to normal. But all those things, those are historically normal to happen, but at the same point, it doesn't make it easy to deal with, right? Because your demographics are not stagnant. So I bring this back to the immigration crisis at the southwest border chart that we're showing, which is, it showed through the 70s and immigration increased till about the mid 80s, and then 2000 I think was the peak, and then it started to decline into like the 2010s and late 2010s, and then 2020 it spiked up. It spiked up by a factor of like 7x. It's crazy, right? That it went up that much. However, what we have to keep in mind is not whether we should or not, right? That is a totally different question. From a theoretical economic standpoint, we do need more people in our labor market. And, you can agree in how we do it. And I think we all agree that the immigration system in this country is broken, right? Like, it's not a question of whether we need it or not. That's different. It's not functioning properly, right? That's clear. Or maybe it's too well with the legitimate side, or anyway, we want to go down the political path. But the point is you have this huge spike, and most people think, well, wow, that's crazy. Well, I don't know. Are they filling jobs that no one else is filling? I mean, this is a real problem in our country. We have jobs that we can't find labor for. Now, if we go into recession, this problem will be quickly solved because people will be unemployed. There have been a ton of layoffs, and there are plenty of companies that need workers, so they're going to hire. But this is where the recession problem comes in. And this is kind of my lead in into the recession, right? We have this recession that's just right beyond the horizon. We can't see where it's starting, but we know it's right around the corner. And people have been talking about this recession for over a year. And I don't know when it's going to happen, right? I mean, it gets to this point. It's like, is it going to happen? I don't see how it can't, but it's not in the data, right? It's in the data in minor ways, but not in a way that you're like, oh my God, we're definitely having a recession. It should happen, right? And all the data and all the trends lead up to the fact that it should happen, but it's not. So I think we have to keep in mind that, and I started with the with the immigration and the labor market thing, because I think what we think should happen or will happen doesn't often happen in the way that we expect, right? And maybe these migrants coming to this country, is 2.4 million migrants that were reported. Maybe they're going for farming jobs, right? Or maybe they're going for high tech jobs. I have no idea. But I know that there are jobs that need to be filled, and we have a very low unemployment rate, which means that when you have that, it just as much as a high unemployment rate can stymie the economy, a very low unemployment rate can also stymie the economy, because it means that you can't fill the jobs that we need for growth. If we need to grow and you can't hire an employee, it means you're not growing, right? As an employer myself, I know if I'm trying to hire somebody, so I know in 2009, we had 200 applicants for an admin job. 200. We had people with CFAs and law degrees and PhDs applying for this job. And it's not a job that required that. It's a simple admin job. But we had high quality candidates because everybody was unemployed. Everybody, I mean, hyperbole, but so many people unemployed and they just wanted work. Well, that was an example of having way too many people applying for jobs that they were overqualified for. But now we have too few people who are, we're not looking for anybody. But if I went to hire an admin right now, I probably couldn't find one, because it's harder to find now until you get into a recession when people are unemployed. So you have these ebbs and flows. But the point I'm making is, if you are labor is a really important part of our economy. And if we don't have enough labor excess or slack, if you don't have enough excess with the labor market, then you're not going to have enough room to grow, which means that you're not hitting your full potential for growth. So we'll see what happens in the next recession, but I know that this is a problem, and whether you agree with the immigration problem or not, we're not here to judge that, but I do want to point it out, because I think you need to understand all sides of the issue. If you're looking at it, it's it's not just whether we should take immigrants or not. The question is this going to stymie our economic growth? And if it is, what do we do about it? Right? Like, and there could be multiple solutions. There's not one solution to it. There could be 50 solutions. So I wanted to start out with that, just kind of with the mindset as before we kind of pull into other things. But Doug, any thoughts on this before we pull into the next charts?
Yeah, I think. Well, I think there's a couple. I mean, when you talk about inflation, and I know that this you touched on something. This is very politicized, right? We have a lot of people that have very strong opinions about how our system of immigration should work, and we're not going to get into to either side of that today. But the point is there's definitely challenges on getting the right amount of people to do those jobs. I mean, we had years in which, again, as you know, from the college planning side that I'm on, is that we tried to drive everybody in our society, and there's still some of this philosophy of driving every child in our society into a 4-year education. And we had a lot of kids that grew up that went out and got, and nothing wrong with a liberal arts degree, but again, depending on what that degree was in and what they're doing with it, we basically said, go out, get a 4-year degree. That's the path of success for the future. And there is correlation between a 4-year degree and a greater economic outcome within a confines of a limited amount of data. I mean, it is true that if you go to college with a 4-year degree, you have the potential of a higher income. But that's also that depends on what you got your degree in and making sure you're going to college for the right things. But what we did is we drove probably a generation, if not 2 generations, into thinking that going out and working in manual type positions was not a positive path in terms of societal view. So we really lost a generation or 2 of people with technical skills that are highly necessary to keep the infrastructure of our country running. Right now, we're starting to see a shift back of that. We're starting to see more people go to technical school and come out with those degrees, but we have, without question, a shortage of it. I mean, try to go out there and hire someone to do work on your house, or a plumber, or God forbid, someone with masonry skills. And that's just a couple examples out there. And some of the best people in those fields have gotten older and older, and they're dying off, and they haven't been replaced. No, the new generations, a lot of them still don't want to necessarily follow in their parents' footsteps. They don't want to be mentored in that. You add in social media now, and I can't, the number of people is like, yeah, what does this generation want to do? They all want to be on social media. You can't blame them. You could go on social media. Hey, here we are. Hello. And we're not one of them, just to be clear. But there are people out there that are very successful, making millions of dollars per month. Okay. And if you go make millions of dollars per month, putting your face in front of a camera, then why would you go through years of training for medical school, which, by the way, is another area that we're starting to see concerns of shortfalls, right? It's a lot of work, a lot of cost, a lot of grind, a lot of misery to become a doctor. And you talked to a lot of doctors about what it's been like to live that life with the pressures of Medicare and corporate medical. And there's a lot of doctors that will tell their next generation, you don't want to go this path. There's a lot of doctors that I know have dropped out of it due to burnout, and that are becoming, going into research where they can make a very lucrative, career, and they don't have to deal with the grind. So we have, without question, labor issues. A lot of that is who's going to school. What are they getting those degrees in? And for two generations, a lot of the things that we think about, again, if we start talking about border immigration, a lot of that border immigration isn't necessarily going to be, in kind of those medical high-tech fields. A lot of it's labor, but we got people that don't want to do those jobs. Now, some of this is being fought against with what's going on with AI and innovation, right? And we've seen, I think Wendy's just came out with the first all automated Wendy's. Now, there's still people working in the back, but there's nobody working in the front. You go up to a kiosk, beep, 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 punch it in, boom. I don't know, conveyor belt. I haven't been there. It comes out. There's nobody serving your food. They've eliminated. I mean, you think of it. If Wendy's can implement this, Kirk, how many locations around the country that and you think about the shifts, right? They can only work so many hours, for time. So just front staff working at these locations, you've now eliminated, I don't know, 10 to 20 people per restaurant times thousands. So there's this weird dynamic of what we need, who wants to do that work right now, and ultimately, where is the automation? Where is the technology going to eliminate those jobs? But then I'll just leave it on this. But doesn't just stop there. I know someone who was just talking to someone who is in a call center in Costa Rica. And this person, and without giving up too much, let's just put it this way. They're a doctor. They're a doctor working in a call center. In their country, a doctor is not considered to be the pedestal that we put medicine on in our country. Our country was built around a system that is basically turns medicine into private business. Okay. Down there, it's nothing. Well, if we take a look at what's happening here, and this is where you have to think ahead. It's like, okay, we got a doctor or a dentist or someone who's specialized working at a call center, Costa Rica, and medicine and medical prices are going up. And we have a shortage of new doctors going in. Well, guess what? Is the next wave of that immigration going to be people who are trained in those skill sets in other countries, but completely different levels of economic need and demand? Again, I don't have an answer here, but there's no question that that immigration is not an area that's just isolated to people that carry a hammer. This is going to be pervasive amongst multiple sectors of our economy. I think I lost you, Kirk. You on mute?
There we go. All right.
There we go.
Tech issues here, Doug. The mute button's pretty small. All right. So let's. So I want to use this as kind of get into some other parts of this. So we want to talk about how all this impacts the rest of the economy. So here's the next chart here, which is wage growth for American workers. Now, if you look at this, it kind of shows from 2007 to today. It shows kind of like wage growth is average right around somewhere around 3%, right? It goes up and it goes down, but an average 3%. If you look back at 2020, it went up to like almost 7%, skyrocketed and then came down. So right now it's around 3.9. So, it's a little bit above average, but I think it's important just to keep in context kind of where things were. Now, I want to use that as an intro into this chart. Home prices versus income. So if you look at historically, the 70s, 80s, 90s, up to pretty much 2000, home prices and incomes were generally pretty correlated. They were similar, in terms of percentages. They're not identical, but they were pretty similar. Well, lo and behold, 2000 hits and home prices skyrocketed. The growth went up 80%, whereas income growth was like 13. Then it crashed in 2008. And then now it's back to 102%, although that was recently. Now it's at 92. The reason I bring up this chart is this. We talk a lot about on this show about equilibriums, right? Finding a balance. And this, you could probably run a bunch of numbers and put together an algorithm and say, all right, here's what it should be. But the reality is it's never a number. It's usually a range, right? So if you look at this chart, and for those of you who are just listening, I'll try to explain it. And if you could go to the YouTube, or you can go to our website, you can see it. But basically, they're pretty similar. Through the 70s, 80s, 90s, up to 2000, they're similar patterns. Okay, let's just say that. Some of them sometimes they're a little off, but they're basically similar patterns. You can look at it and say there's a lot of correlation there. Okay, you can't always deduce causation, but there's correlation there, right? Higher income leads to higher home prices. Lower income leads to lower home prices. I'm not saying that leads to that. Those happen to also align with recessions and growth periods too. So there's like I said, it's I'm just showing you the correlation. Now, 2000 hit and home price growth skyrocketed, whereas income was pretty stagnant, actually went down a little bit. Now, I want to point this out because in the early 2000s, if you guys don't remember, what happened? Well, there was a tech bubble crash, right? The Fed took us from wherever it was, 6%, something like that, interest rates, Fed funds rate, down to close to zero. And what happened? Well, mortgage rates dropped, obviously. Oh, what do you do when mortgage rates drop? Well, now I can afford a bigger house. So people went out and bought a bunch of houses. They bought them up because it's cheap money. And the house that you could have afforded for $500,000, now you can afford $1 million house for the same monthly payments. So why wouldn't I do that? So you have this big, boom in home prices, which we all know what happened after that. So 2005, home prices peaked. 2008, they crashed. And 2010 was kind of close to the bottom of the market. 10, 11, I think was the bottom. So you had pretty much a 5-year period from peak to trough. That is very typical. A 5-year period from peak to trough is very typical for a real estate cycle. So, last year home prices went up 10% on a median home price. So I don't even know if we've seen the peak yet, even though I would argue we probably have based on interest rates, but it hasn't shown up in the data as in the same way. So, which obviously we talk about. But I just point this out because a lot of people talk about how, well, it's just supply and demand. No, it's not just supply and demand. Supply and demand is a component of affordability. And this shows that home prices are a lot less affordable than they were decades ago in the last 50 years. Home prices are a lot less affordable, right? Because you could argue when we put out our data here, we said, well, at the end of 2001, home prices were probably peaked because interest rates were close to like 2.5% for mortgage rates. You can get a 2.5% mortgage rate, you can afford a lot more house. Well, mortgage rates are now close to double that. I shouldn't say rates. The mortgage rate, based on the mortgage rate, the monthly payments have close to doubled, which means you can afford half the house. So you could argue, and I point this out because I'm pointing out my own, not flawed, but a way you can look at my data and dispute it is say, well, at the end of 2021, is that accurate? And you'd say, well, yeah, it's possible it's not accurate. It's possible that was an extreme case, and there needs to be a balance. It could be that it wasn't in balance at that time. However, if you look at this chart, you'll see it's really out of balance to begin with. So, and this is the conversation I have a lot is if you're looking at this balance between income and home prices, there is a point where you hit the limit, right? So in the 70s and the 80s, debt was high. It was hard to afford a big mortgage. So the mortgages were lower, which means the home prices are lower. In the last few years, or at least when there were 2.5% mortgage rates, home prices are really expensive. You could argue whether they should be, but home prices are really expensive, which means that you can afford a lot less house. And so if you look at that balance, there's an equilibrium somewhere or a range, right? We don't like looking at specific numbers because that even though math is math, reality is usually messier than that. So we like to look at a range. Is this within a reasonable range? If it's, if you look at this chart and say the 70s, 80s, 90s, well, there was some deviation. There were some periods where real estate really took off and income didn't really keep up. That's still within a range. It's within a range of reasonableness. But if you compare that to the 2000 to 2010, 2010, 2022, it's crazy. It's not even close to where it was before. So these are the things you want to keep watch for. Is you don't have to get caught in the numbers so much, but just look at the deviation from the norm and say, what's going on here? What am I missing? We talked about this last week. What am I missing? Here's an example of what you're missing. You're missing a big deviation between home price growth and income growth. And there is a certain point in time where that just breaks. It just stops working. And yes, people have to buy homes, but fewer people are going to move. And because everyone's virtual, you don't have to move. Hey, I can't move because I can't afford anything else. Okay, so you don't move, right? So I just point this out because it's a really important dynamic, and it's important to understand. Here's a data point for Miami. Rent as a percentage of income is like 50%, really high when traditionally it's right around 37 to 40. Here's the apartment national vacancy rate, which is also relatively high, or at least I shouldn't say it's relatively high. It's growing. It went from 4.1 to 6.8, so it's growing. It's not historically, it's not outside the norm. It's still within the norm, but it's a trend that you should be aware of. So, what are your thoughts there on that, Doug? I know we kind of went down a rabbit hole, and we should probably move to housing a little bit more.
Well, I will lead. We might be able to lead into housing right here because, I'm going to lose my microphone. So as we're talking about this, I think there's another chart that you have got there, and I don't know if you can find it, Kirk, but you were talking about how we've got what's looking different. What I thought was an interesting chart is there's a chart we have that shows homeowners' equity to mortgage debt outstanding. Okay. And what you're hearing a lot right now is, of course, that people locked into lower interest rates. We've got some charts that show that too, the number of low mortgages that are out there with lower interest rates. We've also got, people like to talk about how much debt has been paid off, how many homes are free and clear. Well, what I thought was interesting is that if you take a look at this chart that I'm referring to, there's not as much free and clear as people think there is. Actually, if you look at homeowners' equity spiked up between 2000 and 2008, as we all know, before the crash of 2007. Mortgage debt at the time was rising steadily. Now, mortgage debt outstanding has remained fairly flat from 2008 to present. It's actually just about just above where it was in 2008. That doesn't mean that it's gone down. Mortgage debt is still very much out there and very real. Okay. Now, homeowners' equity, on the other hand, if we're looking at valuations here, this was looking at mortgage debt outstanding in the, there's roughly, the value of housing stock or the homeowners' equity surged to about $30 trillion. So this is numbers that are in the millions. So if we look at $10 trillion in mortgage debt outstanding, and now we take a look at homeowners' equity, which is close to somewhere in the range of 40 housing values, close to 43 trillion. That's a lot, but we still have over 10 trillion in mortgage debt outstanding right now. And we have a freeze going on, obviously, because people that are sitting on this debt, and as I said, we've got some charts that have shown kind of where the average percentage mortgage is. And a lot of people are sitting in that kind of 2 to 4% range. They don't want to move. Okay, because if they do move, they're going to go into a house that's now going to cost them 6.5 to 7. Now, interesting enough, the people that are free and clear, We actually saw that there's been a greater increase in the number of homes being available for those people that are completely paid off. Okay. Now, for whatever reason, maybe they're buying another home in cash. That's their thinking. They're not locked in. But the problem that exists here, when it doesn't matter how much equity there is out there, we are starting to see, and again, Kirk can pop up a number of charts here, but we're starting to see a massive spike in the amount of equity people are sitting on, but we're also starting to see a massive spike in the amount of debt that is starting to become a challenge for people to manage. U.S. credit card debt jumped nearly 20% in the first quarter, said TransUnion. There was another report that just came out that talked about Gen Z is starting to get way behind on credit card payments. They want to be able to buy into housing, but this housing is not going to be something that they're going to generally be able to afford. And we've seen a massive spike in credit cards and other revolving plans. Fred just published that it was roughly around $850 billion. And that was in 2020. It went down. We got stimulus, paid off some things. It has spiked up since 2021 to almost $1 trillion of debt. Okay, outstanding credit card debt outstanding. Now, the thing that you're facing with this is that, yeah, people don't want to move right now. But we also, and I was looking for a chart that we had that showed that that we're starting to see the biggest decline in wage growth out there has now been in people making $120,000 a year or more. Okay. Why is that? We're starting to see those service sector, tech, white collar layoffs are starting to pick up. Here's the reality of debt. You can have a tremendous amount of equity. You can do everything you can to not pay that, make that payment the last payment you're going to miss. But if you get in a situation where you now no longer have an income, there's about 20% of the people in a recent poll that a Reventure put out there said that if they lost their job, they would have trouble paying. Now, 60% of people out there said they wouldn't have trouble paying. They're fine. But that 20% that would have trouble paying, that would result, and I think they talked about 12 million homes that are sitting vacant right now that are not on the market. Okay. Now, but granted, some of these are like, if you live in Minnesota, a lot of those are homes that people own cabins for, and they're going to be vacant and they're going to count as vacant. They're never going to become available. But if those 20% of people end up getting in a situation where they've lost their job, you are now going to increase the number of homes that could be available from those people by 2%. If you look at the total number of homes in the United States and you increase the number of vacancies by 2%, that is a massive shock to the system overnight. And also, if we start to look at the affordability index, this is another chart that we looked at. If you take where home prices were, the value of a house as interest rates change. If an $1,850 payment, Kirk, I know, try to keep up with me, I'm all over the place here, but an $1,850 payment at 2.8% interest rates will buy you a $462,000 house. At current interest rates, it's only going to get you approved in an affordability of $280,000. I hate to break it to people out there when they say, well, my house is worth this. It's only worth what people are going to pay for it. Okay. And so if you look at the equity spike that occurred on that other chart, that equity spike is temporary and arbitrary. It's only based on supply versus demand. So this is a supply versus demand equation. And we do have low supply right now because we have a lot of homes that have not hit the market because either people do not want to move or they're trying to rent it out and they're sitting on it. They think they're going to rent it. But we also have had a demand spike. People were able to buy at 2.6% interest rates homes worth $462,000, and that shoves the price of these homes up. It's not there anymore. Okay, so do we have now? So we've seen a bump. We've actually seen house prices spike to begin this year. Well, that happens. We have incredibly low inventory, and some people do need to get into housing. But if we start, I want, again, going back to what you said, Kirk, I forget exactly how you said it. start looking at the things that don't seem right. If we are starting to see an increase in layoffs of people over 120,000, they tend to be people who are going to have a mortgage versus renting. They tend to be people who are still paying a mortgage, who may have bought these houses at pricing according to $462,000 that may be paying $18,000 or $2,000 a month. And does not matter how much equity you have, they're only 1 month away from the next payment due. This is truly, sitting in a situation of payment. Now, if they locked into a 15-year mortgage, now that is now no longer an $1,850 payment. That is a $3,600 payment, because they have effectively signed an agreement with the bank saying, hey, I will contractually be obligated to pay you extra principal on top of along with interest under all conditions. I've signed a contract to try to pay this off 15 years. Now, maybe you wanted to pay it off 15 years, but this is where the slave to the lender comes in. And this is where Dave Ramsey likes to talk about slave to lender. Slave to lender is having a mortgage. No, my opinion, slave to the lender is having a bigger contractual obligation, because I don't care if you only have $10,000 left on your mortgage. You're contractually obligated to pay that next payment. And if you lose your job, you may never get to the end of that 10,000. So this is where we are seeing, and I know more and more people over the last 10 to 15 years, as interest rates dropped, signed up for 15-year mortgages at higher payments to pay them off. Now, maybe that higher payment of 15 years was lower than what they had as a 30 before they refinanced, but it wasn't as low as the 30 they could have had under their refinance at the lower interest rates. So they are locked into payments, credit on mortgages that they are financing through the income that comes in and goes out every month. We're starting to see at the lowest tier, again, Gen Z, some people did buy homes, and a lot of them bought homes at these higher prices. And now we're starting to see, on top of that, it's a great image you just put up there. We are going to now see one thing that very few people have talked about, and you're hearing it here. It's something I deal with. For the last 2 years since COVID, they had extended deferment of payments on student loan. Now, Kirk, I don't know if you want to go back to the chart of what student loan outstanding debt is according to debtclock.org, but we are literally talking about trillions of dollars of student debt. And so if we go into the total student debt out there, $1,785 billion in student debt out there. That's an average of $40,000 per student, but we all know not every student actually took out debt. So that means the average of everybody that took out debt is much higher, and they haven't had to pay for a couple of years. So as inflation spiked, as they bought homes that were overinflated, as job losses start to compound, as automation starts to exacerbate that. I mean, we talked a little bit about the impact of AI and what that could lead to in terms of what jobs may be reduced or eliminated. And now you start talking about the burden of those credit card payments, because here's the thing, Kirk, those are variable interest rates, right? So as credit card payments went up and people got behind and interest rates went up, the minimum payment due automatically moved. It's not a fixed fee. Now you start adding in the fact that many of these people stopped paying their student loans for 2 years. They didn't have to. And although the new rules are going to allow those student loan payments to be much more favorable in terms of what you have to pay due according to your income, that's still an extra payment nobody was accounting for. Utilities went up. Food went up, although thankfully food has come down. We got some charts on that too. Eggs have finally come back to earth. We can go out there and we don't have to go out there and, we don't have to rob the chicken coop anymore, Kirk. It's I can actually go invest in gold because it's cheaper than eggs these days, or a better value than eggs these days. But I think this is the one thing people aren't looking at is we already had inflation and erosion. We have people that don't want to move, but between job losses, new service of debts that weren't out there, and increase on service of payments of credit card, we are starting to run into some things that I said, do a sniff test, things don't smell right like that. And I know people are saying, oh, but it's all fine and dandy. And listen, consumer sentiment is absolutely a calm right now. Nobody is reacting to anything going on. But if we have another rise in interest rates from the Fed, we start to have these things tick. Again, at some point, there's a breaking point. I don't know when it's going to be, but you have to be aware.
Yeah. So I want to, and just for reference, I'm so glad that we don't have to go stealing eggs from the chicken coop. Those mama hens are mean. Uh, so anyway, but yeah, I think it's important. We haven't talked about the bullwhip effect in a while on the show, but that's one of the effects. Chicken egg prices went through the roof, and now they're declining. I'm sure because everyone went out and got chickens. We had chickens last summer; it was great, but I think you got to really want to do that. It's a whole other level of responsibility I didn't need. But anyway, so let's talk about this, because I think what's really important to understand is we as an economy grew quickly over the last 20 years. A lot of that was because of low interest rates and access to cheap debt and plenty of money. And it allowed us to have a lot of growth, and there's a lot of excess, and allowed people to expand their own household economic ecosystem, right? So think of it this way. You have a household budget of let's say, I don't know, you make $100,000. Well, a third of that goes to taxes, right? Or let's say 30% goes to taxes. Now you got 70,000. What does that go to? Well, let's say a third of it, say 30,000, goes to housing for your mortgage rate, right? Well, so you got 30, you got 30. Well, now you got 40 left. What's the 40 go? Let's say 10 goes to food, 10 goes to car, 10 goes to education, whatever. You split it up, right? Whatever that split is, that is your household equilibrium, if you will, when it comes to allocating your resources. Now, what tends to happen is as you grow older, right? Let's say you're 25, you're just starting a family, you're 30, you got some kids, whatever. As you get older, your income increases, right? Your expenses increase. Kids aren't cheap, right? So as you get older, the kids cost more money for different reasons, but you're also making more. So this balance, right? You start low, it's just you. Then you get married, you got twice the income. Then you got kids, and so it kind of has this up and down until you get to this crescendo when you're in your chief earning years, which is usually when the kids are going to college. And you usually have about 5 years after that where you're in your peak earning years, where people really try to save. Well, all of this is fine. It's very normal and cyclical, and it's how families have operated for a long time. Now, the problem is what if you throw a little bit of gas on the fire, right? Let's say, we got some free money. We got our free Trump bucks from the COVID recession, or I got a bonus because my tech company made a lot of money because, hey, everyone's got money. I got this extra money. So now it throws a little gas on your fire, on your engine that you're running your household income. So you make more. Well, what happens is you're making more, but that means you tend to spend more. Like, wow, I've got more money. I can buy nicer shoes. I can join the golf course. I can send my kids to private school. Whatever you're doing, you're expanding your household economics to fit this new paradigm that you're in. Well, the problem is, and that's all well and good as long as things keep increasing, which is what we've had for the last 20 years. Even ups and downs, generally speaking, things have been good, and people have made lots of money, and everyone's feeling great. But in recessions, that's not the case, right? If you had in 2000, you had a lot of money because of the tech boom. You lost, depending on what you're invested in, you probably lost 50% or more of your wealth, and then it went back up. And then in 2008, 9, you lost 60% of your wealth. So you go through these cycles. Well, you don't want to be spending after you lost half your stuff. And so when we look at the economics of your household, and then we realize that when you go into a recession, what tends to happen is your income goes down, but your expenses stay the same, or in some cases they go up. And that is what we're in now. That's what we call stagflation. I mean, it's a symptom of stagflation. When stagflation happens, that's what tends to happen. Your income stays the same or goes down, expenses go up. Either way, there's an increasing spread between your income and expenses, which means that you tend to go into the negative, and you're spending, you're spending assets that you're not earning to keep up with your lifestyle. And what Doug was talking about with Gen Z being behind in credit card payments, student loan debts getting restarted, that's just another symptom. Your expenses are going up. You're not making more money, but your expenses are going up. Well, what happens? What happens when the cost of carrying debt goes from 10% up to 25%? Well, it's a lot less affordable. I might be able to sustain a 10% credit card interest rate, but I can't sustain a 25%. I'll never pay that off. If anything, that the interest rate alone will put me underwater, right? So that's the problem with recessions. And there's other problems too, because when recessions happen, everyone starts, I guess the term would be calling your debt. Now, here's an example I want to point out. So China has been doing this for a while, and with mixed results. So China has been one of those countries. So we were doing this for many decades, where we would lend to poor countries. They wouldn't pay it back, and we'd say, "Well, you don't have to pay us back, but we're going to need something from you." It's like the Godfather movie. I will do you this favor this day, but someday in the future, and I don't know when, I'm going to call upon you. And I expect a favor, right? That's basically what China's doing. We're going to lend to you. Well, if you can't pay it back, at some point in time, I'm going to call in a favor. So what they're doing now is they're squeezing the poor countries. They lent these poor countries a ton of money, and basically they can't pay it back, and they're telling China to go pound sand. China's like, well, we want you to pay it off. We're like, we can't pay it off. You knew that when we came in that we couldn't pay it off. Don't act surprised that we couldn't pay it off. We're poor countries. And I mean, we're talking about like Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Sri Lanka, Ecuador, Pakistan, Angola. These are the ones with the high percentage of foreign debt owned by China. So China is having a heck of a time trying to collect in this debt. However, I can see a scenario where, like what the U.S. did, and I'm not picking on China. I love to pick on China, but the U.S. did this in the past. So I don't even know if we invented it. I think the English actually invented it. But basically, you lend the money, and you're like, oh, you can't pay it back. Well, why don't you do me this favor? I'll put an air base in your country, or whatever the favor is going to be. But the point is when they start calling debt, then these countries can't support it, and that causes a collapse, if you will. Assuming they don't just say, go pound sand, we're not doing what you say. But this is a symptom of the economy, the global economy that we're in. This is why I bring it up. So let's say, I'll give you a perfect example. So 2008, we were starting our new venture, and we had credit cards, we had business lines to put expenses on, right? It's not that we didn't have the cash, but it's easier to spend. Everybody uses credit cards, right? It's how you do business. Well, it turns out it was December 23rd, and I go out and buy something, and I call the credit card company because I was just trying to figure out what the balance was before I put a new purchase on. They're like, "Oh, you have only $100 left." I'm like, $100? I had like $7 grand left in this line to spend. Like, what are you talking about? Like, oh yeah, we reduced that. What? What do you mean you reduced it? We're like, yeah, we needed to make sure that we're not taking on too much risk. Now, this is 2008, right? So mind you, what just happened is the whole banking crisis, banks imploded. It was just a disaster. And this is a new card, which I got like 3 months prior. And, I'm filling it up because we're starting a business. It wasn't a secret. Like, they knew it was new. And, we're making all the payments. Everything was normal. I have a great credit history, never missed a payment ever. And they shrunk the line from whatever it was. So it basically cost me like $7,000 of a line down to like $100. And if I hadn't called them, coincidentally, that would have gone unnoticed because I assumed I had $7 grand to spend. But they decided we're cutting all the lines so we don't increase our risk. That was Amex. That was their decision. They didn't tell anybody. They just started cutting lines and decided we're protecting ourselves. Well, what does that do? Well, for me, it's a problem because I have planned expenditures that I need to spend for the business, buy software, buy office furniture, whatever it was. I had planned expenses. And they basically just said, we don't care, pound sand, we're calling they can't call the line, but they're basically calling the line. And so what does that do? That puts pressure on businesses. right? So if you think about the lenders out there, some lenders don't have a choice. You have a fixed line, there's a mortgage, there's nothing they can do about it. They can't call that. But if you have a variable line, if you have a home equity line, if you have a line of credit from the bank for your business, if you read the fine print, I would say almost all of those say they can call the line at any point in time they want. Now, most of them will say that they just freeze it and you have to pay it off. So, like a lot of home equity lines will say, all right, we're going to freeze it, and then you have to pay it off over whatever the remainder is, and there's some calculation in there. But if you're planning on using that and you need access to that, especially in times of crisis, that's the problem. Is that the system tends to it's the old adage of, bankers will lend you their umbrella when it's sunny, and they'll take it back when it's raining. It's a problem for any person who's relying on debt. So the fact that all this debt is ballooning, and at some point they just start calling it and say our risk is too much, we need to freeze it, and you're like, yeah, but I can't put the roof on my house. The roof's already off. I need to pay the other half, or they won't put the other half of the roof on. I mean, it's just that kind of a thing. So I point this out because this is an example. China is an example of what is going to happen in a recession, in a prolonged recession, and that behavior of managing their own individual risk causes additional risks in the economy. So we talked about the reflexivity, right? Reflexivity is if you think something's going to happen, your actions, in this case, a bank freezing their line or reducing it so you have no additional line, that causes, it may be good for them, but it causes a problem for the borrower. So then the borrower can't do it. Well, if it's causing a problem for the borrower, that means they can't spend it. What does that mean? That means they're not spending for the roof. Well, that means the roofer's going to have a problem. Well, now the roofer's got to cut because he paid his guys, and now they can't work. So now he's got to cut. So this reflexivity happens, and it turns into a feedback loop. Is one major reaction turns into another, and that in a sense causes a recession. So China calling their loans will cause a recession in these countries. Banks calling their loans or lines of credit will cause a recession in this country. And I think we just need to recognize that. Now, they're not doing it at the moment, at least not in mass. They might be individually, but in mass, they're not doing it. But if that starts to happen, that's when you start to see additional problems that may not have been counted. And I'm playing 3 steps ahead on this game just to kind of lay out the game plan for what could happen. So, Doug, your final thoughts before we wrap it up, and we can take it home.
Yeah, a couple things to take on that. I mean, one of the things you talked about is, okay, if the interest rates go, up on the credit, then that means more of a payment for them. But here's the other problem: is a lot of time when individuals get into this type of a situation, they are already so tight on their budget that the interest rate goes up, the cost of living goes up, or something unexpected hits, and then they get a negative month. And that negative month now adds more principal, which then makes the payment go up. So it becomes a downward cycle that they cannot get out of. And talking about credit card limits, it's actually happened to me. Don't think this is a 2008 cycle. There's a card that I wasn't using. God forbid, give you the umbrella and the sunshine, right? I'm not using this card, so it's not a card that I'm putting the bank on at any risk. Capital One came through and slashed the credit limit on it by almost 80%. And I got that notice last year. So they have already proactively started to do this, and they can do that even if the balance is higher than what they're going to reduce you to, which can, although you don't see this very often, result in an immediate amount of a demand for payment due. Okay. Now, on top of that, where was another place that people tap? I mean, think of it this way, Kirk. If someone needs money, what are some of the main sources that they will turn to get money in an emergency situation if they don't have the cash readily available?
Home equity lines and 401k plans.
Yep. I'm glad you brought that up, because home equity lines, the interest rate's gone up. And again, home equity lines are only tied to the equity, which we've already seen is in jeopardy of adjusting. But 401ks loans is something a lot of people turn to. 401k loans in many cases have costs at around prime or prime plus 1 or prime plus 2. I was looking at the prime rating that the prime interest rate this week, according to the Wall Street Journal prime rate, is now up to 8.25%. That means for a lot of 401k loans now, the interest rate you're paying on a 401k loan has jumped to 10.5% or more. Okay. And that money, and here's the other thing, you only given 50% of your balance or $50,000, whichever is less. So thankfully, this does not become something that can get, out of control. But the other issue is that this is something too that is not a guarantee. Companies are getting rid of 401k loans because it is actually a cost to administer them. And it is also a situation that if you lose your job, and this is something I want people to really understand on this, if you lose your job, that money becomes due immediately. Now, if you have a balance that is higher than the loan you took, then that is something that they will pay off with your balance, and it will become an immediate taxable event to you. And if you're under 59.5, that's taxes plus penalties. Add a tax hit on top of the job loss, on top of the rising cost of debt service that people have. This is a very, very serious situation because guess what? The federal government does not allow you to give up those tax liens based on. Funny how they have, courts that will help you to declare bankruptcy and get out of debt. But then they don't allow you to use that on student loans because guess what? Those are federally offered. They don't allow you to use that on tax because that's federal. They don't allow you to get out of the burdens that they have an obligation to or that you owe as an obligation to them. So if you have a 401k loan right now, be very, very careful. And this is one loan that I would try to expedite paying off as quickly as possible because again, job losses could result in a situation on that money you've borrowed that could be increasingly problematic, not only because based on the interest you're paying right now, the erosion of your retirement, but also potentially tax liens.
All right, Doug. Well, where can people find more about you?
Well, listen, find out more about me at procollegeplanners.com. If you have a child that is looking to go to school, I showed you $1.7 trillion in student loan debt out there. So if you are looking at college, you cannot afford to look at colleges that you cannot afford. And unfortunately, as you can see by those numbers, this happens every day. There's logic, there's emotion. College is incredibly emotional. We all want our kids to be happy, but is it worth allowing your child to be happy at a level that will create multi-generational potential financial problems? Because again, as I said, student loan debt is not something that can go away at bankruptcy. And depending on the loan you have, it's not something that goes away at death, which means it becomes their problem too. Get the right college, academically, financially, and socially. And even if you have the money to pay for college, ask yourself, if I could get that cost of college for half off, would I want to? There are ways to do it, to structure to get all your money back. Find out more, procollegeplanners.com. Give us a call. Check out our website. Go there right now, procollegeplanners.com, and download our free checklist. It's free. Why not?
Great. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Doug. And that's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name is Kirk Chisholm, manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on the show. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast in the podcast app of your choosing. You can also check out our show at moneytreepodcast.com. On the website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archived shows. Also, we're now on YouTube. Please check out our YouTube channel. When you're there, please subscribe and leave a comment. Lastly, please leave a show rating and comment on the podcast app of your choice. Oh, and don't forget, do your own research. This show is for informational use only. We're not telling you what to think, merely how to think about investing. We're also not selling any products or services, so do not consider this advice. If you have problems with the show, I blame Putin. Please call him and send him an email to express your feelings. If you're seeking financial advice, talk to an oracle or a fortune teller or maybe just a licensed financial advisor. I'm one, but as I said earlier, I'm not selling anything. But I'm easy to find. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.